Thank you, Dan.
Whoa.
And did you ever,
I haven't talked to him about
Myers?
Yeah. I'm gonna run to the restroom.
Okay.
Hi, Sydney.
sir. How are you?
Here, take that.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program will resume momentarily. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program will resume momentarily. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program will resume momentarily. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Eisenhower Foundation trustee, General Richard Myers.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. If you please take your seats. We got a great afternoon going here. So it says self-introduction, so you only need to know a couple of things about me. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, nominated to be vice chairman by President Clinton, chairman by President Bush, and president of Kansas State University, emeritus, served 6 years out there, came home about 2 years ago, back to D.C. So that's my life story. But I'm here this afternoon in my capacity as a trustee of the Eisenhower Foundation, which has partnered with U.S. GLC to bring our next conversation to this stage. I'm honored to introduce our session on the transformative power of humanitarian assistance as we celebrate 70 years of Food for Peace, the policy implemented by President Dwight D. Eisenhower to leverage food as a worldwide strategic asset for peace. Our panelists will highlight President Eisenhower's modern relevance through a discussion of past, present, and future of Food for Peace and explore how investments in diplomacy and development can address today's growing global hunger crisis. We are fortunate to be joined this afternoon by a very, very distinguished panel. Congressman Steny Hoyer represents Maryland's 5th District and has the distinction of being the most senior member of the House Democratic Caucus, serving for more than 42 years, including 2 stints as Majority Leader. He is a widely respected leader in Congress on international affairs and a long-standing champion for democracy, human rights, and strengthening U.S. alliances and partnerships around the world. Governor David Beasley is the former Executive Director of the United Nations World Food Program, where he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the organization for their success in mobilizing financial support and public awareness for the global fight against hunger. Dina Esposito is the Assistant to the Administrator for the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security at USAID, where she is the Feed the Future Deputy Coordinator for Development and the agency's Global Food Crisis Coordinator. Dina previously led USDA's Office of Food for Peace. Corey Reed is the President of the Agriculture and Turf Division for Production and Precision Ag at John Deere Corporation, where he leads a team that develops and delivers equipment solutions providing value for production-scale grain, cotton, and sugar growers. But before we get to that very distinguished panel, we are joined in conversation by U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack. Secretary Vilsack has held this position not only since the start of the Biden administration, but throughout the entirety of the Obama administration and as the longest-serving cabinet member. Secretary Vilsack is now leading the U.S. Department of Agriculture to increase and strengthen markets to ensure that today's food systems are more resilient and more competitive globally. These conversations will be moderated by former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Dan Glickman, who now serves as chairman of the board of Hunger Free America. So, 2 secretaries, would you please join me on the stage?
Thank you. Well, thank you, President Myers. So I'm just thinking we have Myers, Eisenhower, and Glickman. You know what ties us 3 together? All Kansans. I just had to mention that. So there are a few Kansans in the audience. Some of us are more distinguished than others, but any event, it's great that the Eisenhower Foundation is joined with us on this particular initiative. And anyway, Tom Vilsack is an outstanding public servant, governor of Iowa, secretary, pretty close. He'll be the longest-serving Secretary of Agriculture if he stays on another 4 years. And I haven't asked him what he's going to do, but an outstanding secretary deserves your hand of applause because, and so our topic is basically the whole issue of the legacy of the Eisenhower program, the Food for Peace program. But, you know, there used to be this Sara Lee commercial, and it went like this: everybody doesn't like something, but nobody doesn't like Sara Lee. And what struck me about it is that even people who have problems with foreign assistance generally believe that our food programs serve an amazing purpose, feeding the hungry, helping people to come out of poverty and to sustain a healthy family life and build economic security as well. And no department of government does more for that than the U.S. Department of Agriculture, because it's responsible for a healthy agriculture to feed the population of the United States and the rest of the world. So I noticed recently that you and Samantha Power, the head of within our government, announced this $1 billion additional purchase of food for distressed countries. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about the role of USDA in promoting foreign assistance generally, as well, and our humanitarian assistance specifically. How do you view that as part of USDA's role, and where you think the opportunities are in the future to continue and increase that and continue the great work that you're doing?
Well, Dan, thanks. First of all, thanks for partnering with me on this stage today. Another great public servant who's dedicated his life to issues involving hunger and has never stopped being a strong advocate on both domestic and international assistance. You know, I think the one thing that people don't understand about the Department of Agriculture is how much of our mission area is dedicated to both food security and nutrition security, both domestically and internationally. You mentioned the $1 billion, which was resources taken from the Commodity Credit Corporation. 18 countries have been identified by USAID as in need of this assistance. We take $950 million of that $1 billion and utilize it for the purchase of commodities here in the United States, which are then provided to the countries in need. It's an important relationship and partnership between American producers and those in need. I think American farmers, ranchers, and producers take a great deal of pride in knowing that they help not only to feed people in this country as a food secure nation, but they also help to feed those in need around the world. This is also interesting because we took $50 million of it, of those resources, to take a look at a sort of a new program, to take a look at shelf-stable products that are produced here in the U.S. That might be of interest to countries that are in need as well. Perhaps a little bit easier for those shelf-stable products to get long distances and to be of some immediate use. So a little bit of a twist to the program. We have a good relationship with USAID. We basically provide the resource, and they in turn tell us precisely what commodities are in need and where and what countries we need to help. Now, this is one of many, many ways that we help. You're very familiar with the McGovern-Dole, since there's a Kansas theme here to this
Right.
meeting.
Yeah. I didn't ask him to say that, but it's fine that he did.
Okay.
You know?
And that's a tremendous program in terms of being able to feed young people who go to school. Oftentimes, the reason they go to school is to get fed because of that program. That's operating around the world. There's also a series of fellowships and scholarships and internships. There's the Borlaug Fellowship. Well, that's an Iowan, by the way. There are a few more Iowans than
There are.
Kansans. Norm, basically, obviously, World Food Prize, the developer of the World Food Prize, his vision was essentially empowering farmers to basically grow and raise products in their own home countries. And the fellowship, along with the Cochrane Fellowship, basically helps to provide assistance for researchers, for those in agribusiness in these countries, so that they themselves can produce their own whatever their key commodities are. So it's a combination of a variety of programs designed to send a message to the world that the U.S. wants to be of help.
So it's more than just sending commodities abroad, but that's a big part of it as well.
That's a big part of it. And it's a challenge because you don't want to necessarily send those commodities at a time that disrupts the market in the country that you're trying to help. You want to make sure that it's seen not just as a competition to their own producers, but as a complement or supplement to what their producers can themselves produce. And we're, of course, utilizing research to make sure that they are as productive as they possibly can be.
So we have a farm bill coming, may come this year, may not come this year, and I know that you're wrestling with a whole litany of issues regarding that. You may want to comment on that, but there are 3 lesser-known programs in the Farm Bill. You mentioned McGovern-Dole. There's the Food for Peace program, Food for Progress program. A variety of programs to reduce hunger, increase literacy, improve agriculture productivity, expansion of trade of agriculture products overseas to low-income and food deficit countries as well. Do you see this as a critically important part of the Farm Bill? And you might want to comment on your thoughts about the prospect of a Farm Bill.
Well, it is an incredibly important part. And obviously there's some issues in the House bill that just recently got through the committee process. There is a suggestion that perhaps USDA should take a more active role in the direction of where those resources should go in the Food for Peace program, for example. And of course, the concern about that is that we're not necessarily, quote unquote, the experts in terms of humanitarian assistance and help. We're obviously a partner with USAID, and those folks are the experts. They know where the real hot spots are and where the need is. So I hope that we continue to have a good, strong collaboration between our 2 departments and that we don't put ourselves in a position where we're seen as a competitor. So yes, very important. The trade issue, incredibly important. 20 to 30% of U.S. agricultural products are traded overseas. That's also an important component. We recently announced the RAP program, which is a regional agricultural promotion program, to extend our presence in these countries, perhaps not in the key countries like China and Mexico and Canada, where we already have mature markets, but in perhaps some of those other lower-tiered countries where I think the relationship can grow and expand opportunity for us as middle classes develop in places like Vietnam, for example, the Philippines, places of that nature. The prospects for a Farm Bill, I think, it's not easy. I think at the end of the day, we will get a Farm Bill when all those who are engaged in putting a Farm Bill together are practical and are reasonable about what their expectations are. I think there are some who believe that by taking resources from nutrition and allocating them for other purposes, that will facilitate the passage of Farm Bill. I'm afraid that complicates it to a point where it makes it more difficult for us to get a Farm Bill done.
So I think you've done a very good job of trying to work this bipartisan coalition in farm policy that has been a history of farm bills for the last 60 or 70 years. But agriculture policy can't be totally separate from everything else in our government. How do you deal with the toxic atmosphere, or at least the complicated atmosphere of politics as it affects a farm bill?
Well, I think the key is to have a relationship. I spend an opportunity, I go up to the Hill virtually every month and have an opportunity to have a cup of coffee with Chairman Thompson, and we discuss issues that might crop up in his district or might crop up in the Ag Committee. It's a way of developing a relationship. I think relationships really critically important in this town, and I think we've kind of gotten away from developing those relationships. That may be the antidote to the toxic environment that we currently see, is trying to develop an understanding of where the other side's coming from and trying to figure out how do you get to yes. I mean, I think there are some innovative and creative ways we can get to yes on our Farm Bill, but when people draw fairly significant lines in the sand, if you will, and essentially say it's our way or the highway, that makes it very, very difficult for the legislative process, which is based on compromise, based on negotiation, to work.
So I want to move to the issue of climate because, probably USDA has as much or more to do with climate policy, implementation of climate policy, as any agency of government. You've gotten a lot of money in terms of the congressionally passed legislation. You yourself have really made climate and sustainability kind of a focus of your activities, both at home, but also the impact globally as well. I wonder if you might talk about your work in climate.
Sure. Well, first of all, let's start with the regular programs, which an historic investment under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, under the Inflation Reduction Act, an historic investment in conservation, both in terms of ag and forestry, an amazing amount of opportunity for us to really focus those resources on climate-smart practices. We've also utilized the flexibility under the Commodity Credit Corporation to develop a program which we refer to as the Climate Smart Agriculture and Forestry Commodity Partnership Initiative. It's designed, Dan, to basically create a third category of commodity. You've got organic and you've got regular commodities. It basically creates something in the middle, a value-added opportunity, but more importantly, it opens up a whole new set of opportunities for small and mid-sized producers to be able to increase their income by having additional streams of income. In addition to selling the commodity at a value-added proposition, they're able to measure and monitor the climate result, which in turn allows them to potentially qualify for climate smart ecosystem service market payments. They're able to convert agricultural waste into a wide variety of bioproducts. That creates a new commodity. They're able to embrace renewable energy, and maybe they become the provider of energy to their friends and neighbors through the REC. That creates yet another income stream. And when you combine that with local and regional food systems, now all of a sudden you have a very climate-friendly agricultural approach, as well as an approach that creates multiple ways for small and mid-sized producers to make a living. So that's on the domestic side. On the international side, heavily engaged, we developed the Aim for Climate Initiative with the UAE, an interesting partnership between the United States, a large-scale agricultural producer, and the UAE that obviously has some challenges with reference to outdoor agriculture, but wants to see innovation in indoor agriculture take off. Now over 600 partners engaging billions of dollars in new innovations, and we've got a hub, if you will, a climate hub, where we're sharing information from both our climate smart commodities effort and from the innovation sprints that are part of Aim for Climate. So a combination there of working both domestically and internationally.
Yeah, you know, I'm looking, a lot of people don't realize that the Weather Service originally, I believe, was in the Department of Agriculture, because that's where the needs were mostly as farmers were having to deal with the vagaries of weather. But the climate irregularities, the volatility of climate, both in this country and around the world, is putting intense pressure on farmers all over the world.
Which is why we need flexibility in terms of the ability to respond to some of the challenges. For example, we're dealing with the high-path avian influenza, which is a result of a changing climate. Basically, birds that are virus-filled, they're flyways, they end up spending more time in specific locations because weather is more temperate than before, or you've got issues with the forest, with pine bark beetle basically being able to survive because of warmer temperatures, an impact and effect that is devastating to communities, devastating to forested areas, communities surrounding it. So yeah, climate, weather has a very significant impact, and we're beginning to see more intensity to our storms, which rises the level of need for flexibility in terms of dealing with the emergencies and the consequences of tornadoes and storms and floods that are more severe than we've experienced in the past.
Yeah, there was a report, I think, either in the Washington Post or New York Times today or yesterday, the fact that hailstones are getting bigger. You know, they used to be the largest ones used to be the size of golf balls, although I remember as a kid, we had once the size of baseballs. Now they're talking about softballs and pizzas and, you know, huge things. It sounds funny, but it could be pretty tragic.
Don't worry, folks, that's just in Kansas.
Yeah. Yeah, thank God for that Norman Borlaug who took care of this thing. I want to just go back to trade for a moment. So agriculture exports support I think 1.5 million jobs. I don't know what the exact number of jobs are in this country.
For every $1 billion, it supports about 7,000 jobs. So at the end of the day, you know, you're looking at nearly 1 million jobs that are directly connected to agricultural trade, in addition, obviously, to stabilizing income for farmers. Part of the challenge, though, Dan, in exports is an interesting conversation we're having in this country about China.
Yes.
Obviously, there are concerns about China at varying levels, but the conversation I think needs to be more nuanced and needs to be more layered than it is. It's not black and white. China happens to be our #1 ag customer. Now, interestingly enough, as we look at trade deficits that we're experiencing for the first time in a while, those trade deficits oftentimes correlate to the reduction of Chinese purchases from U.S. farmers and ranchers. The first quarter of fiscal year, our deficit was $6 billion, and by $6 billion was a reduction in activities with China. So I think it's important and necessary for us to really think about how we calibrate and nuance the relationship and conversation about China.
So let me ask you if in the previous administration, of course, we increased tariffs significantly on Chinese products, and then the government came in through the Commodity Credit Corporation and other ways, and in a sense reimbursed farmers or tried to reimburse them for the loss of their products. Did those markets go elsewhere?
They went elsewhere, and they went elsewhere down south to Brazil and other South American countries, which is interesting because Brazil, we used to have a very significant advantage from our transportation system in terms of exports. But Brazil invested a substantial amount of money in their infrastructure, and they sort of closed the gap. Fortunately, we've got the bipartisan infrastructure law that's reinvesting back in better roads, better ports, better airports, better rail systems, and so forth. So we're going to recapture that competitive advantage, and I think we're going to see over time more exports coming from the U.S. and less coming from down south.
So the infrastructure bill gave you a lot of money. In fact, I drool over the money that you had compared to what we had beforehand. But you do have a lot of resources which is a tremendously positive thing.
I'd say three key areas. One, in conservation and forestry, very important and very necessary. We have waiting lists. Two, broadband expansion, particularly in rural places. And three, renewable energy, an opportunity, obviously, for us to transition from fossil fuel-based generation to more renewable sources.
Yeah. So I want to go, staying on the kind of the trade situation. A lot of folks don't realize that USDA has staff, employees, and human capital infrastructure all over the world to promote exports and to also kind of, not that you have your own foreign policy, because you don't, but you work with the State Department and other places. But the USDA is often the place where a lot of folks go to when they want to know what's happening in the rest of the world.
We do. We have folks, staff in over 75 countries. The key to trade is pretty simple. It's people, it's presence, and it's promotions. And fortunately, we've got the resources to be able to do more trade missions, more trade shows, more promotions, have more folks out in the country. It's an opportunity for us to significantly brand the U.S. as a provider of quality food products, and also as a country that understands its responsibility of not only providing and selling, but also providing humanitarian relief as well.
So I just have one question to kind of wrap this up, and that has to do with U.S. leadership on the global stage. You know, you've been in this job a long time. You were governor of one of the most important agriculture states in the country. You were in the state legislature. You headed up a global dairy operation. How important is it for the U.S. to be a leader in development and diplomacy to combat global hunger? I mean, I'm talking even more than just your role at USDA.
I think when the U.S. is on the field, the world's a safer and better place. When the U.S. makes the decision to take itself off the field, I think that vacuum is not filled by any other country, and I think it creates a chaotic circumstance. So I think in that sense, I think we're extraordinarily important and necessary, a necessary country to be engaged in that discussion.
Well, unfortunately, it's time to wrap it up, but I would say this, that we are indeed fortunate that Secretary Tom Vilsack is the leader in American agriculture, has been secretary, and has got a way of looking at these issues, whether it's domestic or global, in a comprehensive way. He's a true example of a great public servant, and I think we should give him a big hand for his role in all of this. I think it's time for the rest of the crew to come up. All right. Hi, nice to see you. Hey, David. How you doing?
How you doing?
As you can see, I was not a natural MC, so we do this as best we
Mr.
can.
Secretary, that was a great introduction.
Thank you.
The rest of the crew.
Yeah. Well, that's how I feel about you, Steny. Anyway, this is indeed, when I say the crew, this is the crew that kind of runs the public and private sector in our food policy, and we're indeed fortunate to have such a distinguished person. And I'm going to start with my friend Steny Hoyer. Any of you from this great state of Maryland who are here? Do any of you? A lot of you know that. This is one of the outstanding public servants. You are the senior member of the Democratic caucus. Is that correct in the House of Representatives?
I'm sorry you brought that up, but the answer is yes.
Yeah. What is indeed fortunate is that I was in Congress 2 years before you, which is really depressing. But anyway, you're still there and still doing an amazing job. And Steny is a senior member of the Appropriations Committee. And, to be honest with you, a lot of what we are at USGLC are concerned about is the role of America and the rest of the world and the resources to be able to conduct diplomacy, to conduct foreign policy. Dina and others know about the importance of the funding. If we don't have the funding, then we can't do anything, to be honest with you. And you've just been through the supplemental bill. You have appropriations bills coming up. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about how do you characterize the situation now? You were able to get some of this legislation through, but it's really been a struggle to deal with the appropriations on a lot of different issues. We're obviously concerned about issues affecting hunger, supporting all the Food for Peace related programs, supporting the 150 account more generally, the things that Dina works on all the time. But Steny, I mean, talk to these people a little bit about the struggles to get these appropriations bills passed in the era that we're in right now.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, and I want to, like Tom did, thank you for the extraordinary service you have given to the country in so many different roles. We really appreciate it, and Dan was one of my best friends in the Congress of the United States. His wife particularly was very active when I was caucus chair, and I thank you for all your service, Dan. As I was preparing to come here, my first thought was, I don't know anything or very little about what these folks know a lot about. So I'm going to yield to you for most things. But I looked up a quote. This is the 70th anniversary, 1953. An Eisenhower quote: "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed." It's interesting that a general perceived as one of the keys for winning the bloodiest, worst war in the history of the world would make that observation, signifying the importance of people feeling okay. Because when they don't feel okay, they look for a white knight. They look for somebody who will feed them and clothe them. They look for despots in many instances. They look for fascism in many instances. John Kennedy said that food is strength, peace, freedom, and helping people around the world who we want to want to help us. So in that context, we manifest that interest in our budgets. And let me just give you not a long recitation here. In fiscal year 24, we cut the ag budget by 6%. In fiscal year 25, the 302Bs, as we call them, which means how much money will be allocated to agriculture, is being cut 11% from the 24, minus 6%, and 19% from what the president asked for. We made a deal in a very messy budget process last year, which did not conclude, as you recall, until the 6th month of the fiscal year in March. And in that budget, we made a deal that we'd only have a 1% increase in fiscal year 25. However, going back to Eisenhower's quote, if you increase, as is proposed, very substantially the money that we are spending on arms, which I will probably support given the status we find around the world. But having said that, if we do that, it's got to come from somewhere. The agricultural budget in 24 was cut 4%. It is proposed to be cut an additional 11% this year. The Ag Appropriation Committee has not marked up, but that is the status we find ourselves in, and that is 11% less than the president has asked for. So in your discussion with Tom, particularly as it related to the international, so many people have said, I won't attribute to any one person, but the less you spend on diplomacy, and the state and foreign operations bill was cut 6% in 24, an additional cut of 11% this year is proposed, a 19% cut from the president's budget. So if you quote and say, every diplomat that you don't fund, you need 2 soldiers. I don't know that that's the case, but you get the point. So the budget that is being proposed and considered this year, as it was last year, has cut a domestic spending scenario, which is about a 60-40, 60 defense, 40 all other expenditures of government that aren't mandatory expenses. So from that standpoint, we're going to have very tough discussions about funding programs so necessary to maintain the peace, which are not defense dollars.
So Dina, I want to go to you next because you have to implement the programs that Congress passes the money for. And so we're in a very tough operating period. But earlier this year, you testified in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about the state of global food insecurity, saying 140 million people in the most vulnerable countries are acutely hungry, and they're a victim of crises, conflicts that have upended their livelihoods, and now are severely malnourished. So I guess, as USAID's first global food crisis coordinator, I'd like your insight on global hotspots, but also how it relates to the points that Steny Hoyer just raised about your ability to actually deal with those hotspots.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for your long career.
You're not on.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. They can't.
Yeah.
How are we doing now? Good? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I just want to thank everybody on stage for their partnership and their leadership. AID could not do the work that it does without Congress, without UN agencies, without the private sector, and really without this audience, people who are out there advocating for the importance of US leadership in the world. And I'm hoping over the course of the next few days, you really have come away with a compelling case. I have started my career in the relief side of the House, but recognizing that food aid only gets you so far, I now lead the development side of the House, Feed the Future's Global Hunger Initiative. And just a point of reference for you all, last year we spent $5 billion for emergency food assistance around the world. We spent $1 billion to help people grow more food to feed themselves and to build more resilient communities. And we see that we are not going to be able sort of to band-aid our way out of this crisis. In terms of conflict, it is true that hunger can very much contribute to conflict. It's also true that conflict drives hunger. They are mutually reinforcing in very negative ways. We have researchers who tell us that people who join terrorist groups in the Sahel, the Boko Harams of the world, are not so much going for ideological reasons, but that they can no longer be farmers, fishers, and herders because the climate is no longer giving them their livelihood. It just isn't possible to eke out the resources they need to feed their families, so they're making really tough choices. We likewise are seeing a correlation between hunger, drought, and migration in Latin America, which we see hitting our own borders. So these are really difficult situations. I think in terms of, there's no single driver of the global hunger crisis. It's really multiple impacts of COVID, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many weather shocks around the world, And all of these things taken together is what's reversing that tide. What's really important for this group to know, though, is that really thanks to the generosity of the American people in the US Congress, we have kept tens of millions of people off the knife's edge with our emergency food assistance. We shipped over 1 million tons of American food, wheat, rice, pulses, vegetable oil, many other products, to 45 million people in 35 countries, and that's something to be extraordinarily proud of. Those resources are purchased by the US Department of Agriculture and programmed by USAID, thanks to the Food for Peace Act in the US Farm Bill. It is an extraordinary important piece of the Farm Bill and of legislation, and we're watching the Farm Bill processes really closely. I think it's really important to note that the Farm Bill, Food for Peace Act within it has really evolved over the last 70 years. It has not been stagnant, and it's based on some really hard-won lessons on how to work efficiently and effectively. It's not only the food that matters, but the USAID teams on the ground that call it forward and design the strategies are giving resources to groups like the World Food Program to digitally register beneficiaries to be sure that the food is getting to the right people, that we're not disrupting local farmers or local markets. Those are resources that are associated with moving food that are part of the Farm Bill. And there's a discussion about the balance of food and cash, and it's something that I think we should pay close attention to. We should really refine and retain what is working well and build upon that. There's just some modest refinements for flexibility, but it is an excellent piece of legislation. It is, again, mostly focusing on the symptom and not the solution. So I hope we can talk more about the solution side.
But it's clear that your ability to continue to provide the resources that you do are dependent upon the goodwill and beneficence of the U.S. Congress and the leadership of people
Absolutely.
like Steny Hoyer.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, but and also the fact that what you do and the money actually saves lives. It's out there impacting people, the poorest people in the world often on a daily basis. So I want to move to David Beasley. First of all, the audience heard before in the introduction by Richard Myers that David Beasley and the World Food Program last year won the Nobel Prize. And just, I think the highest honor that the world could give to anybody in any organization for trying to make this world a better place. David was, of course, distinguished governor of South Carolina, a courageous governor of South Carolina, and an incredible proselytizer for trying to end hunger and trying to improve the lot of people in poor countries around the world. So I wonder if you might talk just briefly about your experience. I mean, everybody knows that you're I say this in the best way possible, you are a zealot for what you believe in when it comes to feeding hungry people. How did you get that way? Who are you, by the way, I guess?
There's an ancient scripture in the Torah that says, about every human being is created in the image of God. And then there's this other verse that says, love your neighbor as yourself. But this Jewish rabbi a few years ago said the actual more accurate translation is to love your neighbor as your equal, because we're all made in the image of God. And if you want to end racism, discrimination, sexism, all these things, then see every human being as your brother, as your sister, as your equal, but yet everybody's special. So it's with that zealousness that I think my mother taught me growing up in the South when we had racial integration and the conflicts down there, that I began to understand our commitment to the human race. And so when I got that phone call from a friend, said, would you be willing to take a role with the Trump administration when Trump was elected? I said, no, I have no interest in doing that at all. I didn't do it with Bush, who was one of my best friends. Oh, how about the UN? I said, well, I'm not your UN kind of guy, And so Bob Corker, Coons, Lindsey Graham, and a group of them said, you've got to take this role at the World Food Program. You're one of the only ones that we think can help counter Trump's perspective about the UN and food security. I said, I don't want the job, but I'll help. Anyway, I took the job. That's a whole other story in itself. And honestly, being a governor, you set goals, objectives, benchmarks, measurables, execute a plan, and being a governor is the greatest job on the planet. But my children will tell you, being the executive director of the World Food Program, feeding the hungriest of the hungry people around the world, there's nothing more fulfilling than helping the poorest of the poor. There really isn't. And so that's why 70 years of celebration is so appropriate today, because no nation on the planet is impacted, not just the hungry, but the stability and security of not just the United States, but nations all over the world. I actually thought I could put the World Food Program out of business when I took this role, because there were only 80 million people out of 7.65 billion people at the time. And I thought, well, there's no reason, with all the wealth and the ingenuity and the creativity around the world, we can't end hunger. But it went in the total opposite direction. In the first year, Dan, it went from 80 million to 135 million because of man-made conflict and climate shocks. Then came COVID. It went from 135 to 275 million. Then with the Ukraine crisis, 350 million people, I'm not talking about chronic hunger, knocking on the door of starvation. And so I would get this argument from my friends on the Hill: why should I send money down to Guatemala, Honduras, or Ecuador, or Sahel, or Syria, when we've got road problems, infrastructure funding needs, education, healthcare needs right here at home? And I get that same question whether it's in the Bundestag in Germany, or whether it's in the Parliament in the UK, Canada, or here in the United States. I said, well, if you're not going to do it out of the goodness of your heart, you better do it out of your financial interests and or your national security interests. And now let me go from speaking hypothetically to anecdotally, and let me give you experiential data to showcase why it's a lot cheaper to go in and address root cause than it is to wait after the fact. The United States has helped stabilize, particularly in the last few dozen years, but I know when I took this role, the United States funding, Trump was vetoing out at first on his initial, not veto, but an initial budget, but we went from basically $10 or $15 million a day, and then when I left, we were at $39.2 million per day. We raised $55 billion because of the friends like Steny Hoyer, Chris Coons, Lindsey Graham, Robert Adhope, John Bozeman, and I could go on, who understood and still understand the impact of strategic international humanitarian aid. And to have Dina up here, she is a star in understanding resilience work and what it means. It's not a matter of just throwing money out there. It's a matter of being strategic so that families can take care of themselves. When you feed 160 million people like we did my last year, we survey people all the time. People don't want to leave home. They don't. But if they can't feed their little children, they'll do what any mom and dad in the world would do. I've been down to that Darien Gap so many times, and down in Central America, down in South America, obviously the Sahel, the Middle East, Ethiopia, I can go on. And it's the same story. Mr. Beasley, we wouldn't have left if we'd had food. Mm-hmm. If we will address root cause, we can end migration by necessity. And then you're left with migration by choice. And that's a whole different debate. And so, Dan, to be here with the experts, as Steny said, these men and women up here know a lot more about food security than I do. They're the experts. I like to be the voice because I believe in what they're doing. And the long-term solution is the private sector. And I think the world and the UN is waking up to realize you will not end hunger without the private sector being front and center. In the short term, we got to end wars, end conflict, so we don't have mass migration, destabilization, and hunger. Because that's why we received the Nobel Peace Prize, because the Nobel Peace Prize Committee clearly understood that the World Food Program was integrally engaged and involved in that connection between war, conflict, and peace security. So let me turn it back to you.
See why they won the Nobel Prize.
Thank you.
Corey, David referred to you and the role of the private sector. Both John Deere and the John Deere Foundation have begun, I don't know how recent it is, but you've invested in grants on strengthening global food systems, increasing food access, assisting farmers, the largest grants in your history. Talk a little bit about why you did this.
Yeah, Secretary Glickman, thank you. And can everybody hear me? Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to all of you for your public sector service. Incredible. to be on the panel with you and just appreciate all of it. I've spent my life and my career in the private sector working for John Deere. And we talk about putting our tools to work inside the company so we can go help feed the world. And I think in many ways, for 187 years of our history, that's what we've done. We've focused on agricultural productivity around the world. No matter where you start, give you the tool to take the next step in agricultural productivity. I think the recognition of why we're doing what we're doing on the side of philanthropy and working in that direction is we understood that productivity and production itself isn't enough. The investments that we make, in that case, in the World Food Program and tremendous work that's going on there, 345, 50 million people food insecure. What we're doing with the 1 Acre Fund, 3 of our largest grants actually in the last year, $19 million to these 3 organizations, World Food Program, 1 Acre Fund, and the Nature Conservancy. The interplay between what happens with hunger and climate is the reason we work with the Nature Conservancy. So what we've recognized for a long time is that we can go to work at the top end on agricultural productivity, but we have to go to work on the causes. We don't have a production problem in global agriculture. We focused on productivity for a long time. We have a conflict problem, we have a climate problem, we have a waste problem. We have to go to work at trying to figure out how to put the tools in place as a company that help address a number of those things. So global agriculture has produced more than 50% more food in the last 2 decades alone than it did just 20 years ago. The problem with that is the number of food-deprived people in the world has continued to increase. So it's not alone going to happen by increasing productivity in agriculture. It has to happen through partnership. We work with Dina's organization in sub-Saharan Africa to think through how do we train and work with smallholder farmers, how do we give them tools. Hello Tractor is one of the organizations we work together with that take the power of productivity that comes from moving from manual labor into a mechanized environment and making it accessible to local people in local villages that wouldn't have it otherwise. We work on basics of agronomy and soil health and what it means to create strong soils that grow more crop and do it with less. So we talk every day about what it means to grow more food, do it more productively wherever you are in the world. Certainly the US is the home of that for us. To be able to do it in a more sustainable way is even more important. So we have global goals around nitrogen use efficiency, around the reduction of herbicide, all the things that we can do, not just to grow more, but to do it much more sustainably and make those tools accessible to people at every level, whether you're mechanizing for the first time or all the way up through the largest production agriculture in places like the US and Brazil. So it's a pleasure to be on the panel, but it's also exciting for us to think about what that future looks like and being able to work together in partnership to accelerate the adoption of those technologies.
That's great. So I want to just talk to you about the whole issue about the future, particularly research, innovation, and what we can be doing to get a better handle on the problems of the future. I know in your district, Steny, you have the Beltsville Agriculture Research Center, which is one of the premier research institutions in the world with some of the greatest scientists. I know USAID is very much involved in agriculture research and trying to deal with issues such as water resources, which is one of the great challenges of our times. Food waste, which you mentioned, which is, about 35% of the food that's grown or raised in the world is not used, and some places the reasons for that are different.
$1 trillion.
$1 trillion.
$1 trillion.
So
2 billion people.
So if you're looking out there and you see what are the big challenges and what can we do in your particular institutions, what answer would you give to people? Like, okay, we got all these challenges out there. Is it just a question of money? Is it more human capital? What are the things that we need to be doing as American leaders in the public and private sector?
What more do we need to do?
What more?
Well, stay the course, number one. And number two, stay focused on the strategic, effective needs and the funding sources. This is one of the big questions I would get, particularly in European nations that were struggling with all these demands around the world. I said, you can't fund every program right now. You just can't do it. You're going to have to be very strategic at which funding programs bring about the best return of investment in a time like this. In food security, there's no question in my mind in the next 100, 200 years, if we don't address food security in the next 20 years, we're going to have global chaos. Because you can go a month without getting a COVID shot. You ever tried going without food for a month? I'm not pitting one versus the other, but the point is you got to have food and you got to have nutrition. And this is why food productivity is critical. alternative sources of food. How do we do this? It's not also a matter of the quantity of food that we need, it's also the quality of food that we need to address, because that is a serious issue as well. When COVID hit and the Ukraine crisis hit, I met with first the foreign ministers in Europe and then the agricultural ministers. And I met with the Green Party leadership. It was really quite interesting. I said, we are in a crisis and we have got to put every available piece of land into productivity so that we get through this crisis, because Ukraine was growing enough food to feed 400 million people, and all of a sudden it's off the shelf. And that was compounded by fuel costs, inflation, fertilizer costs, all the availability of fertilizer, all these factors. And so let me just add this one other little factor, because it was Guterres, myself, Macron, Macky Sall from Senegal, and a group held a meeting to talk about fertilizer production. You got to have, until you find a transition, Sri Lanka really screwed this up, but you've got to have fertilizer. If you don't have fertilizer, you can only feed 4 billion people. We feed 8 billion people because of fertilizer. Now, having said that, which commodities or mineral resources are critical to the fundamentals of stability of nations around the world? So where does the fertilizer primarily come from right now? Russia. So we need to make certain we diversify production of strategic minerals like on fertilizer, so that we're never held captive to any nation that may go rogue. These are very fundamental issues that need to be debated while we continue to move into climate issues, better productivity, better fertilizer, better soil, all these types of issues. But anyway, Dan, I go on and on about this stuff, and you got some experts beside you there. So.
Well, I just wonder if any of you have comments about what we can do in the future to enhance our efforts. Money is obviously a big part of it. You got some of the biggest research facilities in the world in your district.
Let me make a brief comment, because I think it goes to the essence of your question, and particularly as to how the Congress and the President perceive it. I was elected to the state Senate in 1966. In January of '67, Agnew had been elected as well, and he gave an inaugural address. And a sentence that I remember to this day: the cost of failure far exceeds the price of progress. You have to have that concept, because if starving people rebel and the chaos that David just talked about incurs, we will spend much more money. So the trade-off is between a stable world, a fed world, if you will, a world that feels at peace with itself. They're going to have to be fed. And if they're not, it will cost us much more money.
Yeah.
I think that concept of what's the trade-off?
Dina?
Yeah, I'll give you the wonkier version of that, which is that for every dollar we spend in building resilience and helping people adapt to a changing climate, we generate $2 to $10 in economic benefits and avert $4 in humanitarian aid costs. It's a no-brainer, and the balance is just not where it needs to be if we're going to avert the chaos that you're talking about. The second thing is, the good news is, we actually know an awful lot about how to do this. There's a huge room for productivity growth on the African continent. They're only getting about 30% of what they could potentially grow on every acre of land, and we have to partner with the private sector. We want to do more public-private partnerships to really drive change. That's another thing. I said the third thing is empowering women. Women are 40 to 60% of the agricultural workforce in these places. They don't have equal access to information or finance, and these are really the folks who are going to make the vital difference. We need to be very intentional about that. And the policy agenda would be the final. We really need to get the right enabling environment to incentivize private sector. This is something AID is deeply engaged in with partner countries, to make the incentives right to boost productivity and get private sector investment going.
Corey, I wonder if you might have any comments about the gaps in the future, what we can be doing more, public sector as well as private sector.
Yeah, we think about it similarly. We think about it in terms of building blocks. There are core building blocks around the world. No single silver bullet is going to solve it, but in the short term, it's about getting food where it's needed right now. In the long term, it's about putting the building blocks in place that allow self-sustaining productivity in the local level. The hard part today is a lot of food is traded around the world, but most of it needs to be grown at home, and it needs to be grown productively, safely, and in a way that keeps a local society resilient. That starts with stability in their local market, and then it comes from the building blocks of agricultural productivity. And we've seen it play out all over the world. We just have to be consistent in putting those building blocks down. So moving from manual labor to mechanization, being able to give people the tools to have healthy soils, to have great seed, to have good fertilizer, to grow in a sustainable way what they need in their environment. And we'll trade the things that we need to along the way, but you have to give those tools around the world to allow that progression to take place. And by the way, make no mistake, we lead the way right here. We lead the way. The technologies that we develop and deploy in the US, the question we ask ourselves is how fast can we make them accessible to the places that food are needed around the world?
Well, I would just say this panel has been great. And
Dan, can I just make
go
one
ahead,
comment
yes.
before we?
A senior appropriator gets to extend the time of the conference.
We must not forget the extraordinary investments that were made last year, in the last Congress. Not last year, in the last Congress. Yeah. Trillions of dollars in infrastructure, in the CHIPS program. Everything you're doing has a chip.
Absolutely.
Investment to make sure that we are self-reliant on chips. We don't shut down automobile factories or whatever else we have that runs farming.
Tractors, combines.
Tractors.
Yeah.
And thirdly, the Inflation Reduction Act, in the extraordinary investment we made also in science and in the environment. All three of those bills are going to have a very, very positive impact in the years to come.
Very true. And I would just, in closing, would say that remembering that 70 years ago or so, this started because of the leadership of President Eisenhower and the Eisenhower administration. You know, when you look back in history, he did a lot of things as president that have made us a better, bigger, and stronger country today. And so it's a good time to remember that anniversary of his leadership as well. So let's thank our great panel today.
Good to be with you. Thanks for what you do.
Great job.
Always
good job. All right, they want to get a picture.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage USGLC co-chair, Senator Norm Coleman.
Good afternoon. I'm Norm Coleman, former senator from the great state of Minnesota, proud co-chair of USGLC's board of directors. There we go, Minnesota there, the heartland. And a member of USGLC's conservative foreign policy study group. We believe in the greatness of America. By the way, part of the greatness of America is 70 years of leadership in the World Food Program, when President Eisenhower did. Part of the greatness of America, having folks like David Beasley lead the World Food Program. America to be great, America needs to be strong. You need to be strong economically. You need to be strong militarily. You need to ensure that your great nations have their enemies fear them and our allies respect and trust us. It's my pleasure to introduce to you someone who understands that. Our next session will explore an America First foreign policy approach where we discuss a conservative approach to U.S. national security and foreign policy initiatives from a future Republican administration. It will be my pleasure to introduce Secretary Chad Wolf, who serves as Executive Director and Chief Strategy Officer of the American First Policy Institute and brings extensive national security experience to our conversation today. America First Policy Institute is described as the White House in waiting. It was founded to promote President Trump's public policy agenda. As of 2023, I think it has 8 former cabinet secretaries as part of its fold, and it's chaired by Linda McMahon, who's the former head of the Small Business Administration. From 2019, Secretary Wolf served under President Donald Trump as Acting Secretary of Homeland Security. Secretary Wolf's experience spans 2 presidential administrations and the Hill, where he worked as a Republican staffer for Senators Phil Gramm, Kay Bailey Hutchinson, and Chuck Hagel. I have an affinity for those who served in the upper chamber, by the way. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Chad Wolf to the stage, along with our own Michelle Beckering, U.S. GLC's National Engagement Director, who will moderate this session. Please give them a round of applause.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. All right, this is a lot of pressure because this is about coffee break time. So I hope you all got your caffeine before we came in, but I think this is going to be a really robust and riveting conversation, so we're glad you're here. And Secretary Wolf, welcome.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have
Good
you
to be
here on the stage. And as always, thanks to our good friend, Senator Norm Coleman, for his support. So let's dive in. I am going to start by addressing the elephant in the room, and that is definitely a pun intended for our other Republican friends here. Thank you. I needed at least a chuckle, so I know you're with me. But really want to talk about this. So you are here on stage. We've got all the signage. You're being hosted by the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. And you are executive director at an organization with America First in the name. So let's start out with this. I want to really get into what America First means. You will not be surprised to this, but it means a lot of different things to a lot of people, right?
Sure.
There are some who say, okay, America First is America alone, is isolationism. And you and AFPI, I should mention, you look at it very differently. And in fact, you define it as foreign policy engagement in the American interest. And I should note, as everyone knows, you had a front row seat in the previous administration, in the Trump administration. And so you really got to see this idea of America First in action. And so I just want to ask you, let's start the conversation by this. What is the actual true definition of America First? And describe what that means on a global stage.
Well, sure. Well, again, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. I think, what we do every day at the America First Policy Institute is we tackle a number of hard public policy decisions to include national security, what we're talking about here today, and our role internationally. But we approach that from a little different perspective, is what's in the best interest of everyday Americans in making a lot of these hard decisions. And so when you look at national security and you look at entanglements overseas and you look at different priorities from a development standpoint, sort of what we always come back to is how do these decisions affect everyday Americans? How does it affect my mother in Mississippi and others out there? And what's in their best interest? Now, sometimes that can be very clear and very straightforward, and sometimes it's not as clear. So again, America First is not America alone, and it's certainly not isolationism. I hear that often. That's often a criticism of not only AFPI, but this America First movement. That people say, well, you just want to put your head in the sand and go away. And that's simply not the case. It's certainly not how President Trump governed for 4 years and his national security team around him. It's not how they operated, right? And so when you look at a variety of different things and the successes that you had, you've got to start this America First approach, and we'll talk a little bit about this later probably, is what does that look from a leadership perspective? So leadership matters, but also being strong at home matters, right? The strength of the United States is not our great diplomats and others, it's our economy, it's the ability to be energy independent, it's our safe communities, it's our secure borders. And if you're out, if you're overseas and you are engaging with the rest of the world from a position of strength, that's what we talk about being America First. And so I think that's really, really important. We saw that during 4 years of the Trump administration. But you also look at some of the successes, obviously. The Abraham Accords, I think, were historic. Defeating ISIS, obviously, is a very big deal. Engagement with the North Korean leader, historic, meetings that occurred there. This is about engaging the international community, but doing so on your terms and with your priorities in mind, and certainly as it relates to NATO, making sure that that organization is actually investing in European security to the level that they can. These are all things that were that President Trump obviously pushed forward during the administration, and many others. And so, again, the idea here that it's somehow bury your head in the sand and you're only about what occurs within the borders of our country is simply not the case. I think it's about international engagement. It's about that international community. But I think where we differ is how do you do that, and what should the priorities be, and what's the approach? And sometimes you got to go to uncomfortable situations and have uncomfortable discussions. And we did that quite often during the Trump administration. But I think that's what the American people want out of their government. Is let's start having government, whether it's here in the U.S. or overseas, the resources, our treasure that we send overseas, how is it benefiting everyday Americans? And that's sort of where we come at it from.
Well, it's so interesting because I think that really reflects a lot when we're talking to our leaders in our states, right? USGLC has chapters all across the country, and it is similar, right? Because we're always trying to make global issues local, yep. Right? And the easiest way, I think, to do that and the most efficient is what is that direct correlation, to your point, to your mother in Mississippi, yep. To my dad who's a soybean farmer in Iowa, right? What is that return on investment? What's that correlation? Yep. So let's take this a little farther. And while I should note, America First Policy Institute is not the next administration in waiting. Technically, you are led by many people who did have policy experience and were leaders in the Trump administration. And I note that because you are out with a new book called An American First Approach to U.S. National Security. You, of course, are one of the authors. And so I want to dig into that a little bit and talk about the content. Because the book does provide details on what the next America First administration should do to rebuild America's strength on the global stage and the restoration of peace and stability around the world. And I thought it was interesting because when you're talking about national security in the book, you make it clear that national security is not just about having a strong military. Yeah. It's also about how do we have a strategy for using all of our tools, right? The soft power tools as well to protect our citizens. So while I respect, you don't currently speak for the president, no one does, or for his policies, could you share with us, based on your experience, based on the thoughts you put in the book, what would you anticipate the priorities, the next foreign policy priorities of an America First administration to look like? And then I'm going to follow on, can you tease out a little bit more when you're talking about the non-military tools in our national security, like diplomacy, like economic development? How do you see that playing as part of the strategy?
Sure. Well, let me reiterate, and I appreciate you bringing it up for those of you on the camera and elsewhere. I do not speak for the president. He does or former president. He does a pretty good job speaking for himself. Nor do I speak for the campaign, not affiliated. So my views are that of the America First Policy Institute. Now, yes, we have 9 former cabinet members and others that served in the administration. So we have a pretty good idea of that America First approach to not only this issue, but other issues that we face. Look, I think the next America First administration, when it comes to national security and diplomacy around the globe, I think there's 5 areas that I think are going to be, hit them on day one. One is our borders. I think President Trump changed the dynamic. In my lifetime, and I had the bio here, and I've been in D.C. probably too long. When you talk about national security, it almost always starts with a conversation about overseas events and how those events are impacting national security. And I think that's an okay conversation and debate to have. I think one thing that the Trump administration decided to change a little bit is actually let's start talking about the sovereignty of our borders and the security of our borders. So when I talk about national security, the safety, the security of Americans start with our borders. So getting the current historic border crisis under control, I think, is priority number one. And it's not only, you can talk about asylum and you can talk about all these immigration terms, which I'm happy to do. But I think when you just look at the national security threats, when you look at the public safety threats that are emanating from what's occurring along that border, as an American, you have to care about that. You have to care about the the hundreds of thousands or 100,000 Americans that are dying every year from fentanyl, the poisoning, and that's largely almost 90% coming across that southern border by the cartels. So border security is obviously a big component, I think, of a national security issue that's going to face the new administration first and foremost. I think a military readiness, I think rebuilding our military one way or another is something that the folks that will eventually serve at the DoD and in the Pentagon and elsewhere are going to have to get their hands around. I think there's a historic recruitment, retention issue going on in all of our armed forces. And I think, look, that can be contributed to a variety of different issues at play here. I think a large part of it is politicizing our armed forces. The COVID vaccine mandate played a part in that. We had over 8,000 service members that were dismissed from the military, have not come back. Now, that's a relatively small number when you look at it overall, but that has a lingering effect that you've got to deal with. And then when you look at some of the other issues that they're dealing with there, and you look at some of the divisive DEI requirements and others that are being imposed on the military, I think that's something that an America First administration will have to deal with. And then the three other areas, I would say, two involve a hot war, one involves more of a strategic war. Obviously, I'm talking about Ukraine, Israel, and then China. And I think those are three areas that any incoming America First administration is going to have to deal with, and is going to have to put that peace through strength test, right? That approach to the test when it comes to all of those. Obviously, the situation with the CCP is a little different. That's more of a long-term challenge that we have for our national security, and it demands different solutions. But when we talk about leadership and we talk about that America First, is how do you get the situation in Ukraine, obviously in Israel, two different conflicts that are ongoing, but how do you address those? So I think those 5 areas are something that any national security team that's coming in, hopefully will be coming in, is going to have to take a hard look at.
And just to build on that, because these are big issues, and you have outlined some really heady areas of national security. I mean, do you see how we can better utilize some of those soft power tools in that? I think of our National Security Advisory Council, who are all former 3- and 4-star generals. Many of you are here with us today, thanks. We have a lot of conversations about the fact that by the time the military has to come in, right, it's almost too late. And are there better areas where we can, utilize prevention?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is about that bold diplomacy, right? How do you execute that? And again, I think that comes, I talked about it a little bit earlier, that comes from a position of strength. It's hard to do that if folks around the world do not respect you. It's hard to do that around the world if you draw bright lines and then you go past those, or I should say our adversaries go past those, and no one's holding them accountable, then your words start to fall on deaf ears. And I think that's what we've seen over the last couple of years. And I think if you contrast that with that bold leadership, and then knowing that deterrence is there because you're going to hold individuals accountable. So that's before the military, the armed forces even get involved, right?
Sure.
Of course, you have to be willing to use them in certain instances. You don't want to. And then there's the development side and how you use development dollars, development resources in the most strategic way, but then also beneficial to the American people. And I dealt with that at DHS. Obviously we were dealing with a number of immigration and border crisis and other things that we were doing with folks in Mexico, but also Central America and a little bit in South America. And we used development dollars. And what I found, it may not be the case everywhere across the world, is it was very transactional. That we get what we would need if they got what they need. And that was the relationship, particularly with Mexico, a little less with some of the others. But providing dollars after dollars after dollars, which I think folks, at least that are on my side and conservative, saying, hey, we need to stop this foreign aid because it just goes into a black hole. We don't see any benefits. And what are we getting when we've got problems here at home? I understand that. I sympathize with that, and I think there's a big element of that you've got to address. But I have seen where development dollars and development resources have been used effectively to advance American interest. I think you got to be clear with the American people about that, and so that they understand that. So when they see millions of dollars go into a foreign government that they may not even can point out on a map, that they know that that's being used for a very specific purpose to get a very specific result for the American people.
No, I think that's such a great point, and it drives so much of what we do at USGLC with our advocacy. To your point, to help the taxpayer understand, where is this money being invested? What does that look like? What's the return we get? And we know there is a market return. You said one of my buzzwords, you said China. So I got to ask about China.
Big buzzword.
It is. I don't know if buzzword is right, but we're going to talk about China. So you have said before, and I'm quoting you, the most long-term strategic threat to Americans, the homeland, and our way of life is the threat from China. And I think many people agree with that, and I think it's easy to see why. Yep. If you look across the world right now, right, China has actually more diplomatic posts than we do across the world. They have also increased in the last 15 years their development investments by 525%. And increasingly, we're looking at the trade component, of course, and right now, China is the top #1 trading partner of 120 countries around the world. And so, President Trump in the first administration really spent a lot of time talking about and unveiling how the United States, how the administration was going to address this challenge. And I always think it's important, there was a lot of really great groundbreaking, I would say, initiatives specifically in that development space that offered a really credible alternative, right, to the CCP's influence and instruments. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, DFC, you've heard from them earlier today, which really modernized, right, how we're investing across the world and trying to really show that we can be that better partner and option than China. The Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative, something I was really proud to work on, which really looked at how do we invest in women overseas, right? Knowing that women, when you invest in women, right, you see a really marked return on the stability and prosperity of a country. And then finally, getting to your point about foreign assistance, right? Under the administration, there was the piloting of this new approach to modernizing foreign assistance called the Journey to Self-Reliance. And it really got to the point you just made, right? Let's really rethink our strategies and our partnerships and our policies so that the dollars we're investing, right, in foreign assistance, right, really lead to increased outcomes, right, in the end of needing to do so. And then lastly, I'll say, because we have so many private sector partners in our coalition, I think there was such great progress in sitting back and better saying, where does the private sector come in? And how do we as the US government sometimes step back and say, how do we harness the private sector, the ingenuity, the innovation, the financing, right, to meet these goals? So on that note, knowing that so much was done and piloted, again, if you had to put, your sort of pull out your crystal ball, how do you think a second Trump administration would build on those successes and really, employ all of our tools to compete with China, not only from a national security aspect, but economically?
Yeah. So let me reiterate again, I don't speak for the president or the former president. Let me make that abundantly clear. Look, I think I'll answer that in a couple of different ways. I think China, as I said in a 2020 threat assessment that I issued at the time from the Department of Homeland Security, is the #1 existential threat to the United States. They're here in the United States, they're overseas, they're everywhere. Their ability to try to defeat the United States is very different than in Iran, even Russia, and others. And it's the most, sort of day in and day out, I think it's the one thing that most Americans need to keep an eye on. It's also probably one of the most difficult things, because if you're every day living your life in America and you're not listening to this or others, you may not see China. Right? Yes, you may see TikTok and you may see a couple of things that are owned by the Chinese, but are you seeing that ag land being bought up by the CCP and others? Are you seeing the infiltration of universities and even, I would say, primary educational institutions being influenced by the CCP? Probably not if you're not looking for it. So look, I think our #1 greatest threat and again, I give President Trump a lot of credit for this. I think if you were to go back 2014, 15, 16, we were talking about China and the CCP as a competitor. Right now, I think the right term is an adversary. And it's not like you need to go to war with them, but you need to start treating them in a different way and in a different environment. And again, I give the previous administration a lot of credit for doing that. So what does that mean? There's a couple of really easy things I can say that are really, really difficult to do, right? Decoupling ourselves from that supply chain that originates in China and elsewhere. Obviously, we saw it during COVID, that medical supply chain, but pharmaceutical and otherwise. I think we need to obviously rebuild our military and our military alliances to confront that Chinese ambition and aggression on a variety of different fronts. They are making they have more shipbuilding capacity than we do at the moment. They have more polar icebreakers than we do at the moment. They're not even a polar nation. And so you really got to think, where are their investments to where the United States is investing? Trade practices, obviously, is something that President Trump and Ambassador Lighthizer, I think, made a lot of great progress on. I think if he ends up winning and you see a second term, I think he's going to continue to build on all of these, including trade practices. There's something that we talk about at AFPI a lot. I know Ambassador Lighthizer does, and it's called reciprocity. And it's this idea that we allow China and Chinese entities to do certain things here in the United States that they would never allow U.S. entities to do in China. Whether we're talking about student visas, we're talking about buying land and ownership in companies and the like. And we need to start to wake up to that. Otherwise, that's going to come back to bite us, and I think it already has. So I think all of those things are issues that we've got to confront. China, we can talk Belt and Road. We can talk about a variety of initiatives that I saw traveling around the world as well. When they're giving out money, they'll say they're giving it out, it's a loan, and what it does to developing nations. And the U.S. has to be there. We've got to be present for those debates, and it's difficult. And it can't be solved with our military all the time. It's solved with that soft diplomacy, development dollars, engagement, but you've got to be there on the ground doing it day in and day out.
No, I couldn't agree more, and I know it always gives me great pride when you can go to a country and you can see that U.S. private sector investments happening, right? And I'm always struck by when you go to these countries too, right? There is still the American dream, right? They want to partner with us, and I really appreciate your point but we have to be there. So in closing, first of all, I want to say thank you for your long-term public service, and you've had some heady positions. You've dealt with, everything from, terrorism to border security, and your work has brought you all across the world. So in closing, I just want to talk a little bit about that sort of positive ending, right? Which is, I still believe in the power of America as a force for good. I know you do, or you wouldn't be in the line of work that you're in. So I'm just curious if we can make it really personal here, and you can sort of share with us here in the audience what, I guess I would coin, what was your aha moment? In all of these years of public service dealing with these really tricky issues, right? What was that moment where you kind of step back and realize what it's worth, to you personally, to our citizens, for America to be engaged out there in the world?
Well, that's a tough one. I served all 4 years during the Trump administration, served in the Bush administration at a much junior level. And so this idea of service, you served, others here have served, and if you haven't, obviously you're in the private sector and you're contributing to the mission. So I think there's just something about innate inside most people about giving back to the country, greatest country on earth, one way or another. For me, probably a couple of different instances kind of come to mind on what is the role of the U.S. government around the world, and particularly at DHS, I saw that where, I came in early 17, day one at 17, and had a certain experience level, but then that grew over the course of a couple of different years, and I understood how the department really relied on our international partners to make sure that we were securing the homeland here at home. What we could do overseas, particularly at that time, if you think back in 16, 17, making sure that you didn't have enemy combatants coming back from the battlefield, coming back into Western Europe, and then coming into the US. How we were working, how we were vetting, how we were doing all of those different things. And it started to click in my mind, like this is what securing the homeland really means. It's working with our international partners. Yes, it's about securing the borders, and we can do more and better of that, but it's also how are we projected overseas. And so when I would travel internationally and was curious, I got different receptions from different people, depending on if they liked our policies or they didn't. Some good stories there. But I think it was all very interesting. And then just personally, there's always that one moment or two where you always question and you say, is it worth it? Right? Because people that serve in public service, and thank you to everyone who does or serves in the military, there is a price to pay on the home front, on birthdays that get missed or holidays or different sacrifices. And I remember a period of time, and this just tells you the kind of environment that we now find ourselves in 2020, where my house was protested day in and day out, almost every weekend. And my kids, who were 12 and 13 at the time, had no idea what was going on. All they knew was people hated their dad. And so people, around the neighborhood and others would be like, oh, this is really terrible. You've got to, you need to find a new job, right? And for me, it actually did the opposite. I said, nope, I'm doubling down now. Because, look, if someone's in front of my house protesting, it usually means I'm doing something right, not something wrong. So that was one moment. I have others, but it showed me that there are some things that are worth fighting for, and not everyone agrees, and it seems like 50% will agree and 50% won't. But if you have a good moral compass and you know what the right thing is that you're doing for the right reasons, then you just got to blaze that. So that would be one aha moment.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for your service, and thanks for your candid insights today. We really appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage
We need a quick-
USGLC Director of Development and Strategic Partnerships, Dana Bruce.
Excuse us.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and so excited to be a part of this panel. As they said, I am Dana Bruce, Director of Strategic Partnerships and Development here at USGLC. And I'm sure I'm not the only one here today counting down the days until the opening ceremonies of the Summer Olympics in Paris, where we are going to cheer on Team USA. Why don't we do a big cheer right now? Yeah. The Olympics and other major sporting events provides a lens into how sports and public diplomacy can gather different folks around the same table from different countries and different cultures. And the US can leverage all aspects of our culture, from sports, music, food, iconic brands, and educational exchanges, to show what America stands for, all while building alliance and partnerships. We have 4 game changers here with us today to share their thoughts on the power of sports and public diplomacy. And again, I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation. First up is Congresswoman Sydney Kamlager Duff. She has represented California's 37th district since 2023 and has spent her career fighting for families in her community at the local, state, and now national government level. She uses her platform on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Congressional Black Caucus to advocate for democracy and human rights, as well as advocate for the African diaspora community. You might know Stephen Howard. Who in this room is from Illinois or from the Midwest? He played for DePaul, and then a little team called the Utah Jazz. And he has spent his post-NBA career as a sports envoy for the US State Department and has lived in 12 different countries across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. He's heading out later this week, and I'll let him share about that. And he travels around the globe to share strategies and concepts to help individuals and organizations enhance their performance while representing the United States. We also have with us Jim McGreevy, who is not only a USGLC board member, but he works for this a little unknown beverage company, the Coca-Cola Company, and where he brings more than 20 years of public policy, political advocacy experience. And then we have Dan Mickelson, who maybe is a little less known, but you're going to learn a lot about what the State Department does through his role as the chief at the U.S. Department of State Chief Sports Diplomacy Officer. So I'm going to welcome everybody to the stage. So we have a panel of 4 very prominent, smart, amazing people today, and we've got a lot to talk about. So we're going to keep it short so we can get in as much as we possibly can. So I'm going to start, Congresswoman, with you, and then I'll turn to Dan. This decade, we're going to see several large sporting events. We were talking about this backstage, hosted across America. The inaugural CONCACAF Women's Gold Cup, and I did have to look that up, how to pronounce it. The 2026 World Cup across North America, and again, the Summer Olympics in Los Angeles in 2028. These events uniquely convene individuals and countries and cultures, and they provide a powerful public diplomacy opportunity. Congresswoman, your home city will host a number of these matches, as well as the Summer Olympics. As we prepare to open our doors to meet these different cultures and countries, what does it mean for Americans to connect with the international delegations and showcase the best of America at major events that millions of people will be watching?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for the invitation. It takes a lot to get me here before votes, but I thought this was a very important discussion to have. Sydney Kemlager-Dove representing the 37th Congressional District. So we will be hosting those events as well as the All-Star Game and the Super Bowl. And those will actually be happening all by 2028. So I have the utmost confidence that not only will Los Angeles be able to open its doors and receive the millions of folks that are going to be coming to Los Angeles and then traveling throughout the state, because we have amazing assets across the state of California, but it's also going to be an opportunity for us to engage with the international community with the expertise that we have in Los Angeles. If it's about innovation, if it's about healthcare, if it's about tech, if it's about arts and culture, whatever you are thinking you are interested in, VC, entrepreneurialism, it is happening in Los Angeles. And I think that sports is, and international sports activities are probably the single best, most fun, most effective convening mechanisms to talk not just about sports, but also to talk about diplomacy, to talk about development, to talk about cultural exchange, and to bridge cultural gaps. And I think at a time when folks are feeling isolated more than ever before, the importance of sports cannot be overstated.
Well, building on that, Dan, in a moment where there is such isolationism and polarization and distrust between and within societies, how do you envision these global sporting events to bring life into and advance America's diplomatic efforts?
Well, echoing the Congresswoman, it's great to be here. Thanks for hosting such a wonderful event. I would say it's not just through 2028. We've got what we're calling a mega decade of sporting events happening here in the United States. Actually started 2 days ago with the Cricket World Cup in Dallas, the CONCACAF Women's Gold Cup, and it ends with what we think is going to be the Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games in Salt Lake City. And we don't have those quite yet, so knock on some wood, but I think we feel fairly confident in winning those games. And what that gives us is a full decade, an opportunity that we've never had before, to really look at sports as a vehicle to nurture social inclusion, gender equality, and tackle some of the tougher conversations that sometimes we tiptoe around. And what's great about these games for the next 10 years is they're gonna bring tens of millions of visitors to the United States. Billions of eyes are gonna be on the United States. So we have an opportunity to have some of those more difficult conversations while those games are happening here.
Well, I don't know if you guys notice how tall I'm trying to sit up right now, Stephen. I feel like we're about the same height right here. But you're talking about all eyes on sports. And Stephen, you have traveled to Indonesia, and you're traveling to Indonesia this week, right?
No, I was there last year. I'm going to Sri Lanka.
Oh, Sri Lanka this week. Yes, excuse me. And you're a sports envoy speaking to the benefits of playing sports across borders and continents. So first, what motivated you to become a sports envoy? And can you tell us a little bit about the role? What does it mean, and how does that contribute to peace building in these countries?
Well, I guess first, as far as what motivated me to be a sports envoy, when you get asked to represent your country globally, for me, it was one of the greatest honors ever to be bestowed upon me. So I was honored just to be asked, and something that I enjoy doing. I'm a child of educators, and so for me to have the ability to travel across the globe and to teach young men and women the sports that I love. And one of the things that's great about sports is it breaks down barriers, and it forces you to really leave your comfort zone. And once we get these young men and women outside of their comfort zone, then it's a little bit easier to expose them to the values of America and things that we want to espouse as far as gender equality, equity for all stakeholders, competition, fairness, empathy and compassion, and being able to do that and bring those American values while teaching the game that I love. It's what better thing for me to do?
I think it's a wonderful thing for you to do. So speaking of American values and American culture, Jim, I want to turn to you. Coca-Cola is a global brand. It's one of the most recognized brands worldwide. It reaches to nearly every country. I shared as I was researching this, I came across the video, I'd like to buy the world a Coke. But it's also a force for good, as your supply chain served to distribute vaccines during COVID and pandemic. You espouse water stewardship. So how does Coca-Cola and America's businesses contribute to our soft power and our global public diplomacy efforts? And can you provide some examples of how the brand promotes American values?
Sure. Well, thank you, Dana, and to Liz for having me on the panel today. Let me just give you a statistic about who the Coca-Cola Company is. We are 700,000 people in 950 facilities in over 200 countries. We are the longest standing partner, to the importance of sports in diplomacy. We are the longest standing partner of the Olympic Games, starting almost 100 years ago with the Games in Amsterdam in 1928. We are one of the first sponsors of FIFA, starting in the early 1970s. So Coca-Cola has really understood the importance. And if you go to any sort of big game in any country, whatever that game is, whatever that sport is, you're likely to see a Coca-Cola sponsorship there. So we've always seen the connection between sports and our company. And we also, going back to that old phrase, when it comes to American values, we think globally but act locally. Of those 700,000 people that are in the Coca-Cola system worldwide, some of them work for over 250 bottlers in this country, in this world. In the United States, that's 64 bottlers, and many of these businesses are family-run for generations, and we see that across the countries, across the world. So we spend a lot of time with those bottlers and the U.S. government, nonprofit groups in a variety of countries, working on ways to improve the living conditions and situations for people across the globe. I'll give you one example, and that's our work with USAID and the Gates Foundation on Project Last Mile. If you think about the Coca-Cola Company, we are essentially a large marketing company, right? We are making fantastic products that fit the needs of the people in each of the countries that we do our business in. But we're marketing experts, we're supply chain and logistics experts, and have a general sense after 138 years of how to make things work in the most efficient way. So Project Last Mile is an opportunity for us to use our supply chain and our business know-how to help improve and strengthen the health systems in a number of countries in Africa. These are bespoke programs that are created oftentimes in conjunction with the governments in those countries and the US government and nonprofit groups to make sure that medicines can get to where they need to be in hospitals across Africa. And that's a super way of sending the message of American values. It's a great way to get the needed medicines to the people who need them. 50% of people in Africa lack access to the medicines that they need. So it's similar to the way the fellow from John Deere in an earlier panel talked about how they think of this. We really think of the things we can do to improve the situations in the various places that we work in from a strategic way. Project Last Mile is an example of that. It's also an example of how we can bring the tremendous power of an iconic American brand to meet the needs of people every day.
Fantastic. And I'd like to buy the world a Coke. Congresswoman, over your first term in Congress, you've been a champion of America's public diplomacy, including introducing the Young African Leaders Initiative Act, or YALI, to further boost the State Department's efforts to engage with young people across the African continent. What does public diplomacy mean to you, and why should public diplomacy programs like YALI be an integral part of America's broader engagement?
So I don't know about you all, but when you think about the State Department, you do kind of think about very dull bureaucrats that don't seem like they're very, I know, exactly, that don't seem like they're able to meet you where you are.
Not talking about you.
Not talking about you. No, because we're both wearing jimmies, so I know he's hip. But when you think about the State Department, you think about very heady issues, and you're not thinking about things fun like arts and culture and sports. What's so interesting is that those things are the points of easiest access for folks. I might have my guard up as someone from another country when you're talking about public policy, but I'm certainly going to start smiling and getting more animated when you're talking about your favorite athlete, or when you're talking about a favorite moment in sports history, or when you're talking about a favorite movie. And so that's sort of how I approach the role of public diplomacy, because it allows the public sector, the private sector, NGOs, civil society, and everyday folks to participate in those discussions. I'm really focused on Africa because the United States, quite frankly, should be focused on Africa. It is the fastest growing continent. 70% of the population is under the age of 30. It has the largest amount of minerals and natural resources, and we have got to figure out a way to develop supportive, dignified, meaningful partnerships with countries across Africa in ways that are not exploitive but that are celebratory. YALI, the Young African Leaders Act, I think is a great example. I introduced the bill in 2023. I think it is the single most important and largest public diplomacy contribution between the United States with the continent of Africa. There are two segments. One is the Regional Leadership Center, where we have young African folks come here and they're working with USAID and they're working with the private sector, and they're taking that information back with them to their countries. And then there's the Mandela Fellowship, where we have young folks ages 25 to 35 that are coming here for 6 weeks. They're going to our universities, and they are also involved in exchange. The idea is, if you're investing in Africa's future, if you're investing in Africa's young folk, then that will be able to, sort of reap dividends in terms of cultural exchange, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of people-to-people relationships, and then real discussions around innovation, development, entrepreneurialism, et cetera. I've traveled to the continent quite a few times, and regardless of where folks are at, invariably they say, we love the values of the United States. We love the expertise that you all have. We love your ability to support development and infrastructure. How do we do that? And then eventually that conversation moves to spaces about sports or culture or fashion, entertainment, and then healthcare, and then, building roads. And so I think we should not sleep on the soft diplomacy that comes from sports and arts and culture, because it can really allow us to bridge gaps that, we might not have been able to do in the past.
Thank you for that, and thank you for your support of YALI. I had the pleasure of meeting several YALI fellows in Africa last May. So, Stephen, I'm going to turn to you. Noted basketball lover President Obama said basketball can be about a lot more than what happens on the court. And he said this when the Basketball Africa League was launched in 2019. And that's a partnership between the NBA and the International Basketball Federation. Basketball Africa League features 12 teams from 12 African countries, and they will play 48 games across South Africa and Egypt, Senegal, and Rwanda this year. As a former professional basketball player, you guys picked up on that, right? He's a former professional basketball player. How can communication and negotiation on the basketball court translate to how we engage in global diplomacy?
Well, first, as a former professional basketball player, my former teammates are probably going to kill me because you got the senator and Dan over here, sporting the fresh kicks, and I have the, the regular shoes on. I would be the one normally to do that. So, little juxtaposition here. But one thing that, is universal about sports is it is a universal language, and it is one that everybody speaks. And fortunately for America, we are more versed at it than most because we're the best internationally than other countries. You can go to any basketball court or soccer pitch around the globe, roll out a ball, and you don't need Google Translate because everybody just plays the sport. We could do a little experiment. We're gonna split this side. There's a soccer ball over there, and we could just go at it, and everybody would just have fun, play sports, and you break down those barriers. But when it comes to basketball, and I know this personally, I played 11 years in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, 4 in the NBA, and regardless of where I was at, there was one constant theme that once practice started or once we started playing in a game, there was no need and there was no communication barriers because we just were out there playing, and regardless of who I was playing with, what religion they were, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, we all wanted that one thing, and that was to win in basketball. And you had to come together as a team collectively in order to win and be successful. And the same thing goes for global diplomacy. You have that negotiation as far as give and take. And if you're the star on a team, you can't take all the shots. You got to pass the ball. You have to understand the nuance of basketball as far as who is hot, who's not. How do I set the table for my teammates? How do I make someone successful? The same thing goes globally with diplomacy. You have to understand your opponent, your team. How do I set people up for success? What am I going to do in order to make that happen? You also look at, we refer a lot in basketball, time, situation, and score. There's a time, a situation, and a score for an appropriate play. If we're in the first quarter and we're up 10 points, that's an appropriate time, situation, and score to maybe experiment and do a riskier play, half-court lob. If it's in the fourth quarter, we're down by 4 points, 30 seconds, that is not the appropriate time, situation, or score to throw the lob. If you do try that, you're gonna find yourself on the bench. Well, the same thing goes in global diplomacy. There's a time if you have more leverage to ask for certain things, but if you don't have that leverage, maybe it's not that time. And so in diplomacy, you don't want to ask for too much, that's bad, or give away too much, that could be bad as well. So those type of negotiations, and again, that's what I love about sports, is it translates to other areas of the world, and everybody has a scouting report, and we use those on the court to figure out how we're going to compete against our opponent. You have to have good advanced team to scout for the team, and then the communication that you have, that's going to determine whether or not you win the game. Same thing on the diplomatic side. You have your analysts to really delve into your opposition, understanding that, but at the end of the day, sports breaks down those barriers that you have because you have your love of the game, we're playing sports, and you develop those relationships, and within those relationships, if there's a crisis, you can lean on those relationships in order to come to a resolution, a solution with your allies, or even to figure out how you're gonna contend with your enemies. And so those same sorts of things with sports transcend really all areas, and they translate to other areas as well, and it lends itself to global diplomacy.
Well, you just set Dan up perfectly. Great pass.
That's what I'm here for.
So, so on that note, Dan, many might not know that Sports Diplomacy Unit was started and established after 9/11 to reach out to young people in the Middle East through soccer. The Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs at the State Department leads many of the cultural exchange programs, from the sports diplomacy to Fulbright to the International Visitors Leadership Program, to advance our interests. So can you tell us about a recent public diplomacy success that you feel was achieved by the State Department in one of these programs? And how do investments in cultural and educational programs help advance what we've been talking about all morning, national and economic security?
So I'm guessing most people have heard of Fulbright or the IVLP program. I'm seeing some nods. The program on my team that we run is the Sports Envoy program. Lesser known, but I think as important. And what we do 25 times a year is we send former professional athletes, like Steven, overseas, usually pair him up with a female athlete, and we run sports programming overseas to have some of those conversations about gender equality, socioeconomic differences, whatever the issue may be. Usually they're picked by the embassy to actually be tailored to what the community needs. And we use sports as a convening power to have those conversations around a game. Really excited you're going to Sri Lanka Thursday?
Yes.
Yeah.
I need to pack.
Take your sneakers.
It's not all basketball though. We ran a surfing camp in Colombia, a flag football camp in Brazil. We just wrapped up a wheelchair basketball camp in Saudi Arabia. So we go to some of these places around the world where conversations are tougher, and we use sports to have them. My favorite story happened in Brunei a year ago. Until June of 2023, women were not allowed to play sports in Brunei. We sent 2 World Cup champions to Brunei, Laurie Fair and Amy Griffin, to have that conversation and use sports to open doors. And there are some fantastic stories that came out of that week-long program in Brunei. But at the end of the camp, they had a public display of women playing sports, and the government said, you know what? We should allow women to play sports. And that's the power
a big clap.
Yeah. That's the soft power we're talking about, and how diplomacy can change the world using sports. And so we didn't solve their problem. They have a long way to go, just like we have a long way to go with equity and equality in sports here in the United States. But we set them up to have a good chance.
Thank you. And again, what a fabulous example of success. So Jim, I'm going to turn to you because you have a little show and tell over here, I think. So Coca-Cola recently hosted the president of Kenya, and this was very significant. I think I heard it said earlier, the first time in 2 decades a head of state from the continent of Africa has come for a state dinner. And President William Ruto was at your global headquarters in Atlanta, where Coca-Cola announced a $175 million investment in Kenya over the next 5 years, and a new limited edition Coca-Cola can designed by a Kenyan artist, and Coca-Cola flavor as well. And so you've made these significant investments in Africa. Elaborate a little bit on the scale and nature of these investments and how they contribute both to the economic development of African countries and the impact they have locally, job creation, infrastructure development, but also how do they bring back to America's growth and America's global public image?
Yeah, you know, just listening to the discussion here, it strikes me that that everyone on the stage has their own role to play in how we do U.S. global diplomacy, right? So the Congresswoman is proposing ideas and hopefully funding them to improve the policies that lead to the State Department and the guys up here from the State Department to be able to go out and do their roles, to show American values, to hopefully increase support for our values and our country. And then there's the role of the American multinational, right? 138 years Coca-Cola has been around. Started in a pharmacy on Marietta Street in downtown Atlanta to over 200 countries. We are a true American success story, right? So we have these iconic brands that we can show the world hopefully refresh the world. They'll enjoy them, and they'll come back for another one after they have the first one, right? But then also being able to extend our business to the broader world. So Dana raises the recent visit by President Ruto to the US. He came to our headquarters, which is a very proud moment for all of us that work at Coca-Cola. We made the announcement to invest $175 million over the course of the next 5 years in our operations in Kenya. We've been in Kenya for 75 years. We employ, as a system, more than 10,000 people. And we also work with over 500,000 micro and small and medium-sized companies distributing our products. So, we're touching a vast array of the economy of Kenya. And we really made that investment because we have faith in where the business environment is going in Kenya and in other parts of Africa as well. So this was a business decision based on the importance of how we see Africa in our company, particularly how we see Kenya. That will improve our facilities. It will bring more people into the company, hopefully, and it'll create more marketing opportunities. And one of those marketing opportunities is the can that Dana has in her hand. We're happy to say that we are marketing experts and innovators, and this is an example of it. So this is a new product just launched in Kenya in recent weeks. And the design of the can, in particular, is from a Kenyan artist, as Dana said. It's just another way for us to connect as business people to our consumers. And so we're doing that from the business perspective, but from the diplomacy perspective, our investment in that country and in the lives of those people that we can help influence is really a tremendous way of showing who we are as a country, who we are as a company, who we are as a country.
Well, I think it's been a fantastic panel and conversation, and we're going to wrap up with one final question, 1 minute each. And Jim, I'm going to start with you quickly. What makes you optimistic about America's global public diplomacy, besides this amazing artwork and launch of this gift?
Well, listen, I go back to President Ruto's visit, right? I mean, the connection that companies like ours can have in individual countries across the world, meeting with leaders, not just elected officials, but up-and-coming leaders in the country and the everyday populace is very important. And shows who we are as a company, as I said, and who we are as a country. Listen, we have iconic moments throughout the 138 years of the Coca-Cola Company. We marched behind the Allies after D-Day, coming up on the 80th year, to bring refreshment to the troops and to others. We taught the world to sing, right? I mean, there is no better example of American soft power than a can of Coca-Cola in your hand, and we're very proud of that.
Thank you. Stephen, give me a good success or optimistic for the future story.
Well, my intrusive thoughts makes me want to have a Kanye moment and just say me. But I'm just kidding. But for me, it's just, being a part of a panel like this and listening to everyone speak and seeing and hearing all the selfless acts of service. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm a child of educators, and there's no one more selfless than, our educators and our teachers. But being able to be a part of this and when I go to these various countries and visit these places and see the positive effects that we have, like when we're in Palestine, working in the West Bank with camps and seeing these kids work and play together and being able to play basketball. And I remember there was a young lady that you could tell had never played basketball before, and she was in a skirt and some flats, did not have the nice kicks, but you couldn't tell any difference. She was just out there having fun and playing basketball with her new friends. And that's what sports creates. It creates new friends, it creates new relationships, it breaks down those barriers. And with that, we can just hope to create a new world where everyone can, play ball together and win at the same time.
That sounds great. Congresswoman, and then Dan, 1 minute between you. What makes you optimistic about the future?
Well, I guess I'll have a Kim Kardashian moment and say, Stephen, I don't know.
This panel's getting away from me.
No, the power of development, dialogue, and diplomacy. So development, World Cup is getting ready to happen. You know, half of the African countries that are participating in qualifying events don't have the venues available to them to have their athletes participate. So they have to go someplace else. Great opportunity for development and infrastructure to happen. Dialogue, raw circumstances, the stories behind some of these athletes that make it. Some of the highest paid athletes here in the United States are foreign born. So why not use the juggernaut that comes from marketing gurus like Coca-Cola and other companies to help share those stories of what it took for them to get to that team where they're playing in now. In-country ambassadors to allow us an opportunity to learn more about those countries and how we can help. And then diplomacy. I was in Japan a month ago or 2 months ago with the State Department, and doors got reopened that had been closed because I brought with me Hello Kitty Dodger gifts.
There you go.
The power of Shohei Ohtani allowed us to go back to tables and talk to defense ministers and foreign ministers about women, peace, and security issues that are incredibly important to both countries.
Power of the brand. All right, Dan.
Really quick.
Be my winner today. 20 seconds. Most optimistic.
20 seconds. Wow. It's the youth in America that are engaged in sports, and it's the future that they are going to give the sports landscape, coupled with this great decade of opportunity ahead of us. And the U.S. government is going to push for accessibility around youth sports. And I'll leave you with this. If you didn't know, the U.S. government has set a mark of increasing youth participation in sports to 63% by 2030. We can't do it alone. We need great partners to help us get there, but it's youth that give me great hope.
Thank you all. And thank you, everyone. Stephen will be with us tomorrow on the Hill, so we're going to head off, and thank you for your time.
Excellent.
In awe of today. I feel like I have learned, I have probably an angst of a lot of the world that we are thinking about, and I have great hope. Certainly by Don and Scott's last conversation to see the two of them. But we're going to close with the last few moments, and I promise you, you're going to be glad that you are sitting here. Because what today is all about is about hope. If I'm not on the stage or working for USGLC, the greatest joy in my life is to spend being on a playground or running around playing on the floor in a dollhouse with my 3 delicious granddaughters. Because I feel like everything that we are doing here is about thinking about that next generation, about how do we leave the world better for our children and our grandchildren. So I want you to each think about somebody in your life, that's your children, your grandchildren, your nieces, your nephews, somebody in your neighborhood, and think about what's the world we're leaving them. And then think about who you're about to meet. Because when I think about a role model of that next generation who exemplifies that brighter, more peaceful world, it is the individual that I'm about to bring on stage, who from a deeply personal story of unimaginable hardship has the resilience to make the world better. So please join me in welcoming UNHCR's Goodwill Ambassador, Mary Marker. Maker. You sit right here? It's Maker, excuse me.
Yes.
Mary, I told you when I first met you how in awe I am of you. We met, I guess about a month ago, maybe it was a little bit ago. And we sat on stage together. We were in Delaware. Senator Chris Coons introduced us. And literally on the spot, I said, please come and join us to close out USGLC's forum. Let me tell you about Mary, and then I want you to talk. Mary grew up as a young child. She fled the war in South Sudan. Let's close the door because I want everybody to hear this. Colleagues, Billy, can I get your help in closing the door? So Mary fled as a child from South Sudan. Who's been to Kenya, to the Kakuma refugee camp? I have. It is one of the largest and harshest refugee camps in the world, which is where Mary then grew up. But through her resilience, you studied hard. And believe it or not, Mary not only received a scholarship, but accepted it and went to school in Minnesota. And from that, yes, we can clap about that. And graduated with honors last year and is now appointed as a Goodwill Ambassador for UNHCR. What a journey. So Mary, tell us all, not only about this journey from fleeing South Sudan, what it means to you now to be sitting here as the Goodwill Ambassador.
I feel like it's a lot of things to fathom. As a young kid scared in a refugee camp where you don't know what home is and you don't know what home is going to be, the chances of me ever being on a stage like this, on a table to be able to tell my story and to be able to share my reality is almost impossible. To live in a camp where, you know, the camp walls shield you and you are tucked away in the middle of a semi-arid refugee camp that has a population close to 300,000 refugees. For you to be a story of success is almost impossible. For you to ever come out and have that resiliency being handed to you just because of your misery. Even that word in itself, I don't want to be resilient because I had to go through something challenging and something traumatic. As a child fleeing South Sudan and having to fathom trauma, death, all of this, and to be able to watch your parents go through this aspect of loss, as you watch them lose their home and you do not understand what that means, because as a child, your parents are like your gods.
They're
right?
everything.
And they
They're
guide
everything.
you. And I find myself in this refugee camp with thousands and thousands of children whom we all know, we don't know if someone out there is ever going to see our story, is ever going to ever believe in us, is ever going to invest in us. A refugee issue becomes very political. And people forget that there is a Mary who loves to dance and fashion and wants to be on stages where she belongs. That was my journey. And for me to even find myself in Minnesota, that was impossible. You're coming from 100 degrees to Minnesota cold, right? You can imagine how hard that is, you know? And to want to feel welcome, to want to feel like you have a voice, because as refugees, we don't have government speaking for us. It's just us. Right now, I am in front of you. As you see me, this is the whole rawness of my emotions, of me trying to tell you to hear me, to see me, to make me feel acknowledged. And for you to even understand the refugee story, it means that you have to put aside all your political views and actually see me as a child, as a girl that is trying to thrive in this world with no access to anything.
Mary, what's extraordinary to me is, as I've learned your story, is that you took your journey and you're now giving back. So I have been to the Kakuma refugee camp, and so this part is equally extraordinary, is that you have set up your own nonprofit now. Focused on providing access to higher education, so giving back. So not only are you here to sit here to tell your story, but in addition, you're giving back. And you said something, and I'm going to read your beautiful words. For the children of war, an education can turn their tears of loss into a passion for peace. Tell us about this nonprofit, why education is such a powerful tool that you want to give back.
Giving back is everything to any kind of community, whether you're a refugee or not. And for me, education was a false promise. It was a stolen promise for me. I graduate and there is a dead end. Less than 6% of refugees worldwide have access to tertiary education. In Kenya, that is less than 1%. So how do I win? How do I ever win as a refugee if somebody somewhere is not giving back to me and actually recognizing me? So in 2021, we started a nonprofit. This is after I got accepted to St. Olaf. And I'm like, I want to create access. Less than 5% in Kakuma refugee camp, which is in Kenya, have access to electricity, less than 5%. So can they even ever type? Can they ever go online to apply to the Common App and all these other opportunities that are out there? So for me, giving back means creating access to the millions and millions of displaced refugees around the world. By now, when we started our nonprofit, Elimisha Kakuma, we've been able to place over 30 students to US universities like UC Berkeley. We have students at University of Tulsa, at Amherst University, and this is because these universities actually opened up their spaces, and they were like, they saw the value that this is not just giving a refugee student a chance. These students bring so much wealth to our campuses, right? And so thank you to all the universities. Thank you to all the universities that actually pledged to taking our students. There's still thousands and millions of refugees out there that could benefit from universities. So you imagine if each university could take one refugee. Do you know how many thousands of universities are in the United States alone? That could be like pathways that are being opened to so many refugees. So right now with UNHCR, the refugee agency, we are working on 15% by 2030. This we can achieve if we all come together. That to me is giving back. You know, that is welcome. That is inviting us into your story.
So let's keep this thread about what we can do.
Yes.
So I mentioned earlier, actually, to the National Security Advisor to tap into the fact that 114 people on this planet are displaced. You lived this. You know this. You know the trauma of this. What can we do? You mentioned a very specific on education. Yeah. But as you think about the storyline that you and the other children in the refugee camp, what can we do in terms of taking action to address this horrifying part of our world affairs?
Ooh, I think this is usually one of my best spots. Chimamanda talks about...
Okay, listen, everybody.
Chimamanda Adichie talks about the dangers of a single story. Right now in the country, there's a lot of dangers of single stories of refugees. You have so much power to humanizing the refugees that come into your state, into your world. We are mothers, we are soldiers, we are parents that have so much to give, and we are looking for communities that could see us more than numbers, but as people, as parents trying to give back to their kids, you know, as young adults going through puberty, like let us go through that in communities that accept us, that welcome us. So in policymaking, because most of you are in charge of policymaking, can you speak up for us? Because it's one of me. It's thousands of refugees that will never be able to be on stages like this. So speak for us. Be able to welcome us to your communities and into your societies. For instance, when I came to Minnesota, my host parents picked me up from the airport. You can imagine going to the supermarket and there's different types of Colgate. I'm like, I just need toothpaste, you know? Or like, I'm trying to get like coffee, and they're like, do you want 1%, 2%, skim milk? I'm like, I don't understand this. And they were able to help me be able to maneuver that. It's small little things. It's kids coming to tutor, like other refugee kids. It's one person being like, I'm going to teach you how to drive. And I was driving like this with the steering wheel, like literally close to my soul. It's so many small things that the citizens, that people can do to make me feel welcomed. And you can imagine what they will be getting from that too. I will be giving them a little bit of my cultural background. As I learn how to yoga and how to stay warm in the winter, I will teach you a 1, 2, 3 thing about South Sudan, and we get to commune, we get to dine together on a table.
So tell us one thing about South Sudan you want us all to know.
Oh, we are beautiful people.
Well, that we know. I said one thing we don't know.
We are good with basketball, we are good with sports, like in the modeling industry. Well, look at this.
Look at how gorgeous she is.
Yes.
All right, I want to close with a little bit of hope, because I told you this story when we met in Delaware. So when I was in the Kakuma refugee camp, which is why, given that I was there, I'm so in awe of you, I talked to a mom. And I talked to a mom through a translator, and I was brought to her home. Now, to all who did not raise their hand, you know when I say home, her home was a hut about half of the size of the stage. She had, I think, 8 children. There was literally nothing in that hut. And that was her home. And I said to her, she was from South Sudan also. They had escaped. And I said to her, if there was no more fighting, would you go home? And the translator said to me after she talked, no. Why? Why? Because here, in this camp, that there was nothing. There was no toys to play with. It was completely barren. All you saw were these kind of makeshift units, because here, my kids can get educated. Here, my kids can get educated. And there was the US flags having given through UNHCR. Tell us, you had the resilience to be sitting on the stage today. What is that vision of hope that you had to get here, that Mother had to tell me that? What about the other 299,000 individuals that are in that refugee camp and at refugee camps all over the world?
I always say hope is something powerful, but over time it diminishes. If there's no one actually seeing that little hope, it dims. And for me, I wanted to get outside the camp wall so badly. I wanted to dream. I wanted something outside that environment. And for me, I lashed on education. I knew it was a dead end. I knew it was less than 1% that could ever make it out there, but I had to make it, right? And when I got out, I'm like, how can I continue to instill hope in more people? Right now, even with our nonprofit, you can imagine our first cohort is going to their 3rd year of college. The kind of hope it has created within the refugee camp. And this is just one camp. Hope can be instilled, it can be reignited every single time. You might think that you don't have so much to bring to the table or finance or all of that. No, it's you just even starting it. It's you starting conversations around refugee inclusion. It's you starting community events that welcome the newly resettled refugees, because they are going to struggle even in this new country. It's assimilating and having to learn a new language, having to learn stuff. It's really daunting, but you can be that hope. You can reignite that hope. That's what I do, but there's just one Mary. I want there millions of Mary in this room to actually start initiatives and to speak up for refugees like I do.
There is just one Mary, and thank goodness we got to meet her. Everybody, let's thank Mary Maker.
Thank you.
You are amazing. Wow. Isn't she terrific? You'll have a chance to visit with Mary out in our expo shortly. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Before closing up, I'm going to invite my colleague Jason Gross up to the stage. And I know he is going to thank my colleagues, but I want to first thank Jason, as well as Emily French and the entire USGLC staff for putting on this amazing, amazing day. It is so much work. Somebody said, look at this incredible program. And I said, if only you knew what it looked like a month ago. But it really takes so much love and so much energy and so much creativity to do it. So I please encourage you, when you see my colleagues with the staff badges, every single one of them, from the intern to each of the staff members, especially the outreach team, to thank them for all of their hard work. And over to Jason Gross to close out day one for a fabulous program.
Liz, thank you. I am Jason Gross, USGLC's Executive Director, despite the promotion that Senator Coleman gave me before the last panel. also soon to be Donna Brazil's press agent, apparently. I was just informed. It is my honor to close the first day of the 2024 Global Impact Forum and to provide the final speed bump between you and the reception outside. So I promise not to go on too long. Throughout the year, you and this coalition conducts a nationwide discussion on America's role in the world. Once a year, this extended family gathers in Washington, and it comes to affirm the importance of America's global leadership through investing in diplomacy and development. And it comes to learn about the new threats and challenges that America faces on the global stage from our leading experts. For everyone that travels to Washington, for everyone that works with us around the country, to demonstrate to members of Congress that there is a vital, vibrant coalition in support of America's global leadership. We thank you deeply for your continued support, for showing up, and for being part of this journey together throughout the years. During today's deep and rich program, we heard from NSA Jake Sullivan to Chairman Brown of the Joint Chiefs, to our economic security experts, to our breakout speakers, to Secretary Vilsack and David Beasley and our food security experts, to Chad Wolf, our sports diplomats, the irrepressible Donna Brazil and Scott Jennings, and the inspirational Mary Maker to close out our conversation. Take the insight, the knowledge you gained today, combine it with the latest in innovation and impact you're going to learn at the Global Impact Expo, and combine that with your own passion and experience that you bring from around the country. Deliver that to Capitol Hill tomorrow where you go. Deliver it to thank those members of Congress who have supported our cause, and use it to change minds and hearts of those who still need more convincing. Now for some final logistical matters to close out today. You are invited right after this, the reception right outside, for the Global Impact Expo and Networking reception right outside these ballroom doors. Tomorrow morning is our breakfast program in this very room, 8 o'clock sharp. We're going to be joined by Congressman Don Bacon of Nebraska, Congressman Nathaniel Moran of Texas. If you have not yet downloaded your Hill schedule, please look for your email from Advocacy Day and do so. It's key for your visits tomorrow. If you'd like a paper copy, please stop by the Hill Visit Desk. You can get one there as well. Buses will be available throughout the day tomorrow to take us all to Capitol Hill meetings. Now enjoy the reception. Best of luck to you on the Hill tomorrow. We know we will see all of you back here for Global Impact 2025. Thank you so much and look forward to talking with you outside.